My name is Hannah Miller, and I don't remember a single morning in my childhood that began peacefully. Even when the house was quiet, that silence never felt safe. It always seemed deceptive, tense, like thin glass ready to crack at the slightest touch. I grew up in suburban Springfield, in a one-story house with a faded white picket fence and a neat lawn that my father mowed every weekend, as if the order outside could conceal the chaos within. From a very early age, I knew. If my mother spoke too softly, it meant she was afraid. If my father was silent, it meant a storm was yet to come. Their shouts were the background of my life, a constant noise that first frightens and then becomes part of reality. I learned to distinguish intonations even before I could read. By the way my father tossed his keys on the nightstand, I could tell whether it was dinner that night or whether it was best to hide in my room. The way my mother put the pot on the stove told me whether I should ask questions or disappear. I was 6 when I first realized something was wrong in our house. That evening, I was sitting on the living room floor putting together a lighthouse puzzle. I loved it. The pieces obeyed logic, they had a proper place, and if you made a mistake, it was easy to fix. Adult life didn't work like that. My parents' voices drifted from the kitchen, muffled at first, then louder. I didn't understand the words, but I felt a tension slowly filling the space, like a cold fog. Then there was a sound that made me flinch. Something shattered. I remember freezing, holding the puzzle piece in my hands, and suddenly realizing I was scared. Really scared. Not like in the dark or during a thunderstorm, but deeper, as if the world that should have been safe suddenly felt fragile. I sat motionless until Mom ran out of the kitchen, her eyes red. She noticed me, tried to smile, and said everything was fine. I nodded, even though I knew it wasn't true. My father, James Miller, was a blunt man. He worked for a logistics company and often came home tired and irritable. On good days, he could be almost normal. He'd joke, ask about school, even help with homework. But those days were rare. More often, he'd come home as if bringing a heavy burden, which he'd dump on Mom. She'd accept it silently until she broke. My mother's name was Sarah. Once, judging by old photographs, she was a lively, laughing woman. In pictures before I was born, she smiles broadly and openly, hugging my father's shoulders. But in my memory, she was always tense, as if constantly expecting a blow. She tried to be a good mother, I knew that. She cooked, did the laundry, took me to school. But her thoughts were often far away, and her eyes were empty. When I was 7, my father left. It wasn't sudden, although that's how it felt to me. That night, they were screaming again. I woke to the loud slam of the door, and my mother's crying. In the morning, my father's car was gone. His toothbrush was missing from the bathroom, and the bedroom closet was half empty. My mother said that my father needed time, that he would be living on his own. I asked if he would come back. She didn't answer. He didn't come back. The first months without him were strange. The house became quieter, but the silence brought no relief. My mother seemed to lose her footing. She often sat in the kitchen, staring into space, or spoke on the phone in a hushed voice. Money became an issue almost immediately. I heard her late at night calculating on a calculator, cursing quietly under her breath. About a year after my father left, a new word entered our lives: opportunity. Mom said it often and with a special emphasis, as if it were a spell. She started bringing home books and printouts, spending hours on her old laptop browsing websites. She talked about chances, about how we'd lived poorly for too long and now deserved better. At first, it seemed harmless, then strange, then frightening. Mom would forget to pick me up from school. The teacher would call her and she'd apologize, saying she was too busy working. Dinner increasingly turned into sandwiches or cereal with milk. I learned to set my own alarm, pack my own backpack, and heat up my own food. I was 8, and I already understood. If I didn't take care of myself, no one else would. Sometimes, Mom would come home overexcited, talking quickly, laughing for no reason. She talked about money that was just around the corner, about people who knew how to live properly. And sometimes she'd return silent and broken, collapse on the couch, and not get up until morning. On those days, I tried to be as quiet as possible. I didn't know the words dependency or self-deception. I simply felt like my mother was slipping away from me, as if she were drowning, and I was too small to pull her out. I loved her no matter what. And perhaps it was this love that prevented me from realizing how bad things were. By the end of 3rd grade, I stopped bringing classmates home. I was ashamed of the mess, the smell, and my mother, who could suddenly start saying strange things. I learned to smile and say that I just liked being alone. In reality, I was afraid that someone would see our life for what it was. Sometimes I imagined a different childhood. A home where they didn't yell. A mother who laughed sincerely. A father who never left. These thoughts were painful, but I returned to them again and again, like a secret refuge. I didn't yet know that much worse lay ahead. That all this was only the beginning. But even then, at 8 years old, I sensed that I would have to grow up too soon. When I turned 9, I stopped expecting my mother to be the same. It didn't happen overnight or after some special event. Rather, something quietly flipped inside me, like a switch, and the expectations simply vanished. I still hoped, but I no longer believed. It was a strange feeling for a child, to realize that the person your life depended on was no longer a reliable support. My mother retreated deeper and deeper into her new world. Now it was filled not only with books and websites, but also with people whose names I'd heard over the phone. She spoke to them excitedly, sometimes in whispers, as if sharing something forbidden. I caught snatches of phrases: system, risks, reward. You just have to believe. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she abruptly ended the conversation and sat for a long time, staring at the wall. I started falling behind at school. The teacher called my mother several times, but she either didn't show up or showed up distracted, with a distant look. After these meetings, she'd get angry, not at herself, but at me. She'd say I should be grateful she was working so hard for our future. I nodded and felt guilt welling up inside, though I didn't understand what exactly I was guilty of. One day, Mom came home with a suitcase. It was strange. We weren't planning on going anywhere. She set it down in the middle of the living room and started talking rapidly, as if she was afraid that if she stopped, she'd change her mind. She said she needed to go away for a while, that it was very important, that she was doing it for us. I asked where exactly. She answered evasively, saying it didn't matter. The main thing was the result. The next day, I was taken to Aunt Mary's, an old friend of Mom's who lived in another city, in Indiana. I barely knew her, but she smiled too broadly and spoke too cheerfully, as if trying to compensate for her awkwardness. Everything in her house was neat and quiet. There was no shouting. There were no doors slamming. This should have been a joy, but instead, I felt like an outsider. Mom left for 5 weeks. She rarely called, saying everything was going great, that I should be proud of her. I answered monosyllabically because I didn't know what to say. I felt lonely and scared. At night, I lay in a strange bed and thought that if something happened to Mom, no one would even tell me right away. When she returned, I barely recognized her. She looked brighter, louder, as if a new fire had ignited within her. She hugged me too tightly, telling me that now everything would be different. The house began to move again, to buzz, to be full of energy. Mom bought lottery tickets, talked about signs of fate, about the universe finally being on our side. At first, even I wanted to believe it. Sometimes she'd win small sums and rejoice, as if it were proof she was right. We'd order pizza, she'd buy me a new jacket, and for a moment, I felt like a normal kid. But these moments were brief. They were always followed by dark days, when Mom came home late, smelling of smoke and fatigue, when the house grew cold again. I began to dread evenings. I dreaded the sound of a key in the lock because it could mean anything. Sometimes my mother would enter quietly, almost unnoticed, and I knew it was best not to show myself to her. Sometimes the door would swing open abruptly, and she would start talking loudly, too loudly, about how everything would soon change. I grew up next to this chaos, absorbing it like a sponge. I was 10, but I already knew how to pretend everything was normal, to smile when I wanted to cry, to remain silent when I should have screamed. I was still a child, but childhood was slowly fading away, leaving behind a feeling of constant anxiety. I didn't know how this story would end, but inside me, I already had a premonition. None of this would lead to anything good. By 11, I stopped counting the days. I started counting the losses. Lost promises, lost money, lost pieces of a normal life that I could have had. Our house no longer felt like a home. It had become a temporary refuge, a place where I waited out the next storm, unsure of its severity this time. Mom barely concealed her passion anymore. She no longer called it opportunities or chances. She said it outright: casino. The word was thrown around in our house, as often as conversations about my father had once flown. She spoke of him with a glint in her eyes, as if she were talking about something majestic, almost sacred. For her, it was a place where everything could change in an instant. For me, it was a place that was slowly taking my mother away from me. The first few trips were rare. She left in the evening and returned at night, sometimes in the early morning. I was left alone with the TV on and my phone under my pillow in case things got too scary. She left money for food and a note reminding me to lock the door. These notes were the only sign of caring she could still manage. Then the trips became more frequent. Money for food wasn't always available. I learned to stretch things, to invent meals out of almost nothing. Pasta without sauce, toast without butter, cereal without milk. I told myself it was temporary, that Mom would soon win, and everything would be fine. It was easier than admitting she was losing. Sometimes she returned happy. Then the house would fill with noise, laughter, and plans. She spoke quickly, jumping from topic to topic, convincing me that she'd figured out the system, that everything was now under control. I listened and nodded, though my insides sank. I knew all too well that such evenings were always followed by lows. On bad days, Mom barely spoke. She'd sit on the couch, staring into space, or lock herself in the bedroom. I'd hear her crying and not know what to do. It was scary to approach her, impossible to leave. I felt guilty for even existing, as if my presence were just another problem she had to deal with. My grandmother, Evelyn Miller, came every few months. She lived in another state and always brought with her the smell of fresh soap and peace. When she visited, Mom became a different person. The house would be feverishly cleaned, dirty dishes hidden, the windows washed as if for an inspection. Mom would instruct me on what to say and what not to say. I hated these conversations, but I obeyed. My grandmother didn't ask many questions, but I could tell she sensed something was wrong. Her gaze lingered on me a little too long. Sometimes she would put her hand on my shoulder, and the gesture made me want to cry. But I remained silent. I felt like if I told the truth, the world would fall apart completely. The money my grandmother sent me for my upkeep disappeared quickly. I knew it, though my mother never said so directly. I saw receipts, overheard phone conversations, and felt the tension. At 12, I began to understand that adults can be weaker than children. It was a difficult discovery. At school, I became invisible. I stopped raising my hand, stopped laughing with my classmates. The teachers said I was bright, but absent-minded. No one knew that I lay awake at night, listening for sounds outside the door. No one saw how I jumped at every ring of the phone. Sometimes I imagined leaving, just packing my backpack and disappearing. These fantasies were both terrifying and reassuring. They gave me the feeling that I had a way out, even if only in my head. By the end of 6th grade, I no longer doubted that my mother wouldn't stop herself. She was drowning, and I was drowning with her. I still loved her, but love was no longer safe. It had become a heavy burden I carried with me every day. I didn't yet know that the most terrible blow lay ahead. But somewhere deep inside, I was already preparing for it, gathering strength I'd never even suspected existed. By 13, I had completely ceased to be a child, though outwardly I was no different from my classmates. I still went to school, did my homework, and sometimes laughed at jokes in class. But inside, I was constantly wary, like someone who'd spent too long in a dangerous place and no longer knew how to relax. I'd gotten used to living, constantly expecting the worst, and this expectation had become a part of me. My mother disappeared more and more often, sometimes for the night, sometimes for entire weekends. She'd leave me a little money and say she was going away on business. I no longer asked why. I knew the answer. On days like these, I tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. I did my homework, ate whatever I could find, and went to bed early. The silence in the house was less frightening than her sudden returns. I learned to cope on my own. Laundry, cooking, filling out school papers. Several times, I had to forge my mother's signature, at first with trembling hands, then with increasing confidence. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. For a while, things actually did look better. Mom started saying she was getting a grip. She mentioned support meetings a few times, even going back to work. I allowed myself a tentative glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, I thought about the future, about school, about what would happen next. But habits don't just disappear. First, Mom started staying late for work. Then came excuses, fatigue, irritation. I felt the old fear returning, filling my head. Hope proved fragile and short-lived. One night, Mom didn't come back. Not at all. I sat on the couch until dawn, without turning on the light, afraid to hear footsteps and simultaneously desperately awaiting them. When she appeared in the early morning, I immediately knew something bad had happened. She didn't say a word, just walked past me and locked herself in the bedroom. I didn't know then what exactly she had lost. But I knew one thing. The very lifeline I'd been clinging to so desperately in my mind was beginning to slip through my fingers. And this time, the fall promised to be especially painful. I was 15 when everything finally collapsed. Not gradually, not slowly, but suddenly, like a house whose foundation had been undermined for too long. Until that moment, I'd still clung to the illusion that I could somehow survive what was happening, wait until I was older, stronger, freer. But that year, it became clear. If I didn't make a choice myself, circumstances would make it for me, and they would be merciless. I got a part-time job at a small bakery near the school. The work was hard, early shifts, the smell of yeast, constant fatigue. But it was peaceful there. No one yelled, lied, or promised mountains of gold. I knew that if I worked my shift, I would get paid. Simple, honest logic, the kind I desperately gravitated toward. The money was mine. I hid it in an old shoebox under my bed and never told my mother how much I had. My mother had almost completely stopped pretending by then. She would disappear for a few days and then return exhausted, angry, or, conversely, overly animated. Our conversations degenerated into brief confrontations. She accused me of being cold, of being ungrateful, of looking at her like a stranger. I remained silent because any word could cause another outburst. That evening, I returned home from work later than usual. The door to the house was unlocked. This immediately alerted me. The house was in disarray, scattered clothes, dirty dishes, the pungent smell of alcohol. I heard sobs coming from the living room and froze. My mother was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, an empty bottle lying in front of her. She was talking on the phone, her words slurred, her voice trembling. I didn't hear everything, but I heard the main points, the pleas for money, for a last chance, that she was almost getting her revenge. When she fell asleep, for the first time, I did what I dreaded most. I opened her laptop. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I could hear it throughout the room. I didn't have to search for long. The numbers said it all. The account Grandma had talked about. The very same one. It was empty. Not almost. Not temporarily. Empty. I woke up Mom. My voice was shaking, but I couldn't stop. Asked where the money had gone. At first, she didn't understand, then she tried to brush it off, then she started lying. And when she realized I knew the truth, she screamed. She screamed that it was her right, that she was doing everything for us, that I had no right to judge her. I told her it was my future. Then she hit me. Not much, but enough for me to understand. The line had been crossed. I left that same night. I grabbed my backpack, some clothes, some money from the box, and walked out without looking back. I went to my father. It was despair, not hope. He received me awkwardly, like an unexpected guest. His new life didn't allow for my presence. I realized this very quickly, from his looks, his tone, from the conversation behind closed doors. He didn't want problems. And I was the problem. The next day, I went to see my grandmother. She opened the door and immediately understood everything. I didn't have to talk long. I cried, choking on words, telling her everything that had been building up for years. She listened silently, holding me tightly, and in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. Everything happened quickly after that. Adult conversations, paperwork, court cases. I hardly interfered, but I saw how my grandmother fought for me, calmly, firmly, leaving no room for lies. My mother first denied everything, then got angry, then broke down. When the court made its decision, I felt no joy, only fatigue, deep, all-consuming. I moved in with my grandmother. I entered college later than I had planned, but I got in. I started seeing a psychologist. I learned to live without constant fear. It was harder than I thought. Sometimes I felt guilty. Sometimes angry. Sometimes empty. But gradually, space for something new began to appear between these feelings. Hope. I don't know what my mother will become. I don't know if we'll ever have a real conversation. I only know one thing. Her choices are not my responsibility. I survived. I got out. And now I have a life that I build myself.